there has been too much of neglect of the original purpose of making Pakistan, which was Islam. Negative factors about Pakistan are rooted in the colonial rule. Sometimes some laws are referred to in that perspective, and sometimes the ruthlessness of certain actions of certain governments are attributed to the colonial legacy. We have the two-nation theory, which is perceived to be the ideology of Pakistan in the first place. And now that the colonial rule was coming to an end, these two nations had to take their separate ways. In other words, for example, from 1940 onwards, the Muslim League focused on the aspect of difference between the two religious communities. In a way, they mobilized Muslims of all the areas and regions of British India and gave them the idea of Pakistan as the way out. India was a civilization for thousands of years, and within that framework, we tend to refer to Indo-Muslim civilization, which meant that kind of Muslim civilization which was in a way embedded in the overall framework of India. So here, the Muslim minority had to struggle for its independent status. The leadership of the Muslim League predominantly belonged to the minority provinces. Ladies and gentlemen, today's talk is about my book, Political Conflict in Pakistan, published in 2021. And this is about the clash of interests and ideologies in Pakistan throughout its history, and of course going beyond it, in other words, tracing the roots of the conflict in British India and beyond. So first of all, as you all know, there is a situation of despondency in the country. Almost everybody talks about Pakistan in terms of a bleak future and what is perceived as an economic and political security crisis in various ways. That shows that people are negative towards the stability of the country as a whole. So understanding conflict in Pakistan is necessary not only in the present framework but also in a long-term perspective where we shall trace the origins of conflict and of course various dimensions of the conflict in terms of space, time, and whatever is relevant in that context. Here, there are various perspectives of the conflict. For example, some people think there has been too much of neglect of the original purpose of making Pakistan, which was Islam. So the religiously minded people, the conservative sections of society, they tend to demand, for example, rule of Sharia and of course adherence to the Islamic rituals. On the other hand, there are those who feel that there has been too much of Islamization of laws, and there is, for example, a reference to whatever has been going on by way of strengthening of sectarian parties, which sometimes turn violent in this country. All this means that the perspective on conflict is not simple. Various groups and people and stakeholders tend to believe in various reasons and origins of this conflict. Now, often you hear about post-colonialism, which is that quite a few negative factors about Pakistan are rooted in the colonial rule. Sometimes some laws are referred to in that perspective, and sometimes the ruthlessness of certain actions of certain governments are attributed to the colonial legacy. So every now and then you hear about the colonial legacy, for example, in terms of education, in terms of legislation, and so on. So not only that there is a conflict going on between various stakeholders, there is some kind of codification of the conflict. For example, under the Ziaul Haq, there was this civil-military conflict which had reached a dead end, but it was codified in terms of a conflict between the constitutional sources of legitimacy and divine sources of legitimacy. So here we have various perspectives about and around the phenomenon of conflict in this country. Now, starting with the partition, what do we have? First of all, we have the two-nation theory, which is perceived to be the ideology of Pakistan in the first place. Yes, That meant, for example, in the eyes of Ayat Qureshi and other Western historians of Pakistan, that Muslims and Hindus were two nations for centuries. They lived side by side, but as distinct entities, they never mingled with each other. And now that the colonial rule was coming to an end, these two nations had to take their separate ways. In other words, it was a story of conflict spread over centuries. Now, if we look deeper a little into the history of recent centuries, for example, but we have with us the fact that there was intermingling of faiths and, of course, culture. There was quite a bit of a syncretic society in these parts of India and, of course, in those parts which are now included in India after independence. So, when we move towards partition, for example, from 1940 onwards, then there was this exercise in identity construction. The Muslim League focused on the aspect of difference between the two religious communities. In a way, they mobilized Muslims of all the areas and regions of British India and gave them the idea of Pakistan as the way out. So the idea was that Muslims will be turned into a permanent minority after the British withdrawal, and that would mean there would be no way out for the Muslims to express their culture, their commitments, for example, to their faith, and in a way there'll be what was called by the Muslim leadership Hindu Raj in India. Now, from partition onwards, what do we have? After all, India was a civilization for thousands of years, and within that framework, we tend to refer to Indo-Muslim civilization, which meant that kind of Muslim civilization which was in a way embedded in the overall framework of India, unlike, for example, the Middle Eastern Arab nations or Iran. There, the ruling mechanism related to the majority population of Muslims, but not in India. So here, the Muslim minority had to struggle for its independent status. That led to Pakistan. But there was again a lot of baggage. After all, it was part of India. So there was the case of medicine, Indian cuisine, Indian rituals, very much part of social life in this part of British India and now Pakistan. So there were not only such phenomena as migration, that meant Hindus migrating across the new borders to India, and migration of Muslims from India to Pakistan. Now, the pivot of the struggle for Pakistan lay in those areas which were called minority provinces, where Muslims were in minority, for example, UP, Bombay. From there, then, the struggle moved towards Pakistan areas. That means from the center, which was the center of Mughals, center of the British Empire, to the periphery, for example, in northeast and northwest of India, where then finally we see East Pakistan and West Pakistan coming up. Fine. So the leadership of the Muslim League predominantly belonged to the minority provinces. That's how, when the migration took place, the Muslim migrants came from what was the center of British India to its periphery, those areas which are economically, politically, educationally less developed than the center. For example, the two wings of the new state. On the other hand, Hindus migrated from the periphery to the center of what became independent India. Now that means that the people, Muslims who came from India, who were dominant in the Pakistan movement, who were dominant, for example, in the Muslim League, they in fact represented the Muslim High Command. They then shaped the new state in various ways. The first Governor General of Pakistan was a migrant from Bombay, the first Prime Minister of Pakistan from UP, and an absolute majority of the business community and the civil bureaucracy and overall the intelligentsia came from India. That means the migrant Muslims dominated the new state. That's why this book talks about the new country, Pakistan, as a migrant state. That explains quite a bit, for example, in terms of the new ethnic hierarchy, where the migrants, they had a very high position in the state, and of course they had their allies in the form of the province of Punjab, which was the stronghold of the army. So here, various kinds of elite which came from India and the military elite which was rooted in Pakistan, together they dominated the new state. That meant that the migrant elite had left their constituency in India. So in Pakistan, obviously, so the new hierarchy which emerged in Pakistan, at least ethnically speaking, meant that the migrants, particularly the Urdu-speaking migrants, but also others, for example from East Punjab, they tended to dominate the state, and together with the West Punjab elite, they emerged as the insiders in the new ruling mechanism. That's why, from the very beginning, it was called a Muhajir Punjabi state. On the other hand, Bengalis and Sindhis, and Pakhtuns and Baloch, and of course later on, the communities which struggled to gain a separate identity for themselves, for example, Saraiki-speaking people, they were in a way subject to the process of outsiderization. There was this feeling among these communities that the two communities mentioned earlier, Muhajirs and the Punjab, they together represented the ruling elite. That's why within 20 years or so, the pressure on the ruling elite continued to build up for holding elections on the party basis and on the basis of adult franchise.